Milling Through History presents President's Day, Part 3. In our previous two installments, we have seen the country go from a high to a low to a high to a low. And so, as we get ready to enter into our third part, remember to leave any comments of unique presidential trivia that you might know in our comment section below so that other people can learn unique stories that you're aware of that they might not otherwise be. Number 32, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, Franklin Roosevelt is a rather unique president as he would bring about the end of Prohibition and he would attempt to rebuild the nation. Now, some people have argued that his social policies during his first two terms as president did more to lengthen the Great Depression than actually end it. As such, there's a bit of debate, and it really depends on how you look at it. Folks who were alive at the time could tell you that if you were poor, you didn't really notice anything different. You were already poor. But if you had money to begin with, losing it all meant that you were dealing with a whole new life you weren't otherwise aware of. But what made Franklin Roosevelt so unique is that he is the only president to be elected to office 4 times. Now, as such, that is a rather unique thing to have. But part of the reason for why Roosevelt broke the tradition of serving only 2 terms is that international affairs dictated this. The rise of Adolf Hitler and the Nazis were something the Democrats were well aware. And the fear is that a president who was not already seasoned and was effectively aware of the situation would be disastrous for the United States. And the only man who could actually see the country through during this rather tumultuous time was Franklin Roosevelt. Now, Roosevelt did overwhelmingly win the 1940 election and even the 1944. But what is rather unique to note is that if one were to look closely at the popular vote in all 4 of his elections, Roosevelt consistently goes down in the number of votes he receives every single time, which is rather unique to note. One of the other aspects, though, about Franklin Roosevelt is that by the 4th term, he seemed to have had this idea that he might never die. And in fact, Democrats were deeply concerned about the fact that his health was beginning to fail. As such, it was exceedingly important in his final bid for the election for the presidency that they had a running mate that they could trust and rely on to take over for Roosevelt because they knew that his days might not see him to the end of World War II. Number 33, Harry S. Truman. The only president to find himself getting elected to office without an actual middle name. The S stands for nothing, and his first name really is Harry. Truman's parents wanted him just to have a middle initial, and that's why there's the S, and simply put. But for Harry Truman, a man from Missouri, he was actually a farmer and rose up through machine politics to be probably one of the better presidents that we've ever had in this nation, if not certainly one of the most underappreciated. It would be Truman who would see the end of the Second World War, and it would also be Truman who would lead the charge to prevent the spread of communism through Asia. Now, Harry S. Truman is also rather unique with his famous line, "The buck stops here." And as such, most people found eventually by the end of his first full elected term that they didn't like him. In fact, he had a very low approval rating when leaving. But his most famed moment from his presidency was undeniably the election of 1948, when, going up against Thomas Dewey, there's the famous headline that said, "Dewey defeats Truman." And yet, on election day, Harry Truman won and held up that very same newspaper, and the banner above it was "Truman defeats Dewey." Number 34, Dwight David Eisenhower. With the longest last name of any president, Dwight D Eisenhower is a rather unique individual. He was the Allied Supreme Commander of the Second World War, and so when he ran for president, he was already a very popular individual. His time in the White House would see the creation of the federal interstate highway system, and we would also see the growth of suburbia. Now, the highway system is rather unique, mainly because of the fear of a potential war with Russia. And so the highways were built specifically with the idea that there would be straight stretches, then a curve, and then straight stretches again. This would allow for the United States Air Force to land and take off anywhere across the country. And so, if we had to, literally the entire nation has become one big giant runway. Number 35, John Fitzgerald Kennedy. JFK is perhaps one of the more unique presidents to be found because he is the first Catholic president to be elected to office. Now, this is unique because at the time of 1960, there were many people who were deeply concerned about the prospect of having a Catholic president. Does this mean the United States president will be taking orders from the Pope? Well, Kennedy proved the answer to that question was no. But even his election to office was greatly controversial, as many conspiracy theories have come out to say that the mafia actually influenced the vote and was able to swing it into Kennedy's favor. But while in office, JFK did have his own particular moments. Most notable, of course, was the Bay of Pigs invasion, which failed miserably, followed by the Cuban Missile Crisis, which he succeeded in greatly. Unfortunately, though, Kennedy was assassinated in 1963, and his legacy is oftentimes remembered as being the slain president, and many people remember famously his son, JFK Jr., saluting his coffin as he went by in Washington, D.C. Number 36, Lyndon Johnson. Lyndon Johnson did not exactly have a very enviable role of becoming president of the United States, namely because when Kennedy was assassinated, people were deeply concerned that this may have been a more political assassination than anything else. But Johnson ended up being what was considered to be a great reformer when it came to the plan of the Great Society. When it comes to social programs here on the home front, undeniably, Johnson was quite effective, as he would bring in Medicare, Medicaid, he would be pushing through civil rights. He wanted to basically try to live up to Kennedy's legacy. Now, it didn't hurt that because of the closeness of the 1964 election, Johnson would be overwhelmingly voted into office. However, what really doesn't help Johnson, though, was Vietnam. For Johnson, he wanted to be another Franklin Roosevelt, and as such, he believed that getting involved with Vietnam and being a successful wartime president would permanently seal his role as one of the greats. Instead, it failed miserably, and the famous chant of, "Hey, hey, LBJ, how many babies you killed today?" would be one of the hallmarks of his legacy. Number 37, Richard Milhous Nixon. Richard Nixon. Where to begin? Well, his election in 1968 was certainly an unbelievable one. In fact, his victory was quite astounding and what was undeniably one of the most heated election years to be found. Richard Nixon is also unique as he was the president when man finally reached the moon, and he was able to bring about an end to Vietnam. Perhaps most famously, Richard Nixon also went to China, the first United States president to do so. And yet, in doing all of this, you'd think, wow, why isn't Richard Nixon so revered? Answer, Watergate. The Watergate break-in and the eventual cover-up that was being done by Nixon made everyone believe that he actually was heavily involved with this scandal. As a result, Nixon was forced to resign in disgrace in 1974, and the nation was rather bitter during this time, basically howling for his blood, because they couldn't believe that the President of the United States could potentially be this crooked. Number 38, Gerald Ford. Now, Gerald Ford certainly walked into the presidency with a great deal on his shoulders. In fact, most people would criticize him for the most notable action during his time as president, his pardoning of Richard Nixon. Now, when asked why Ford did this, Ford had very bluntly stated, "We need to put this behind us and move forward." That was a big deal. But Gerald Ford was also a good case study for contrast. As Richard Nixon was seen very imperialistic, here's Gerald Ford seen much more down to earth and more like Joe America. In addition to this being a PR situation, his staff always attempted to try to make Gerald Ford seem more human, and so many of the gaffes which were caught by the press were oftentimes staged, mainly because they wanted to show that the president could be likable and human. But regrettably, this probably did more damage than did good, because Gerald Ford would only serve out the remainder of Nixon's second term and was unsuccessful in trying to get his own re-election bid in 1976. Number 39, James Earl Carter. For Jimmy Carter, this is a man who was the governor of Georgia, and he came from a state where it was basically only one political party in charge for the longest time. When he arrived in Washington, he came into a bit of an unfamiliar territory, namely having to deal with an opposition party that had a bit of power attached to it. To further complicate the matters, the U.S. economy was tanking, and we had a period referred to as stagflation, where everything was stagnating when it came to wages, when it came to imports, exports, and prices were inflating. To further make matters worse, there was the gas shortage crisis, and then, only to get worse, was the Iranian hostage crisis. One crisis after another can only do so much for a president, and as such, when 1980 rolled around, Jimmy Carter was looking for re-election, but he had certainly a very high mountain to climb in order to try to win re-election. Number 40, Ronald Reagan. It's morning in America again. That's what Ronald Reagan said. When Reagan ran for president, he ran on a position that said our best days were still ahead of us. And in winning the election, the first thing that occurred was that all the hostages who were being held in Iran were released the moment he gave his oath of office. The first action he did was send Jimmy Carter to meet with these hostages in order to welcome them home, namely because it was Carter who spent a great deal of time trying to bring them home. The first term of Ronald Reagan, though, wasn't exactly what one would call perfect. Most notably was the air traffic controller strike, where Reagan famously fired all of them and did not exactly endear himself with a lot of folks involved with airline travel. But by the end of his first term, the economy was turning around, and we were seeing the boom of the go-go 80s, which meant Reagan was able to win a whopping impressive second term as president, as he won every state except Minnesota and Washington, D.C. The second half of Reagan's presidency would see the Iran-Contra affair, which would see Ollie North getting into trouble, but Reagan seemingly was untouchable. And so when he left the White House, everyone felt much better about the United States. Number 41, George Herbert Walker Bush. Yes, this is a mouthful. However, George H.W. Bush comes in after Ronald Reagan and soon discovers that he will be a wartime president, as he would have the Persian Gulf crisis, or Persian Gulf War, occur. This war lasted really only about 6 days, and Bush would have a 90% approval rating as a result of this. By 1991, with 90% approval, everyone figured he was a shoo-in for re-election. And yet, the economy tanked. And with this downturn of the economy, very quickly, Bush found himself in a lot of trouble. Add in the arrival of Ross Perot as the third-party candidate, and this split the Republican vote, which would allow for the Democrats to put their candidate through into the White House. Number 42, William Jefferson Clinton. Better referred to as Bill Clinton, the arrival of Clinton is rather unique, as in both of his presidential elections, he never won 50% of the popular vote. He always won a plurality, but he still won enough to actually win the elections. During his first term in office, Clinton found himself at the receiving end of quite a few scandals. Most notably, of course, was Whitewater, Monica Lewinsky, 2 government shutdowns, and seemingly it looked like he could have been a one-termer. And yet, all of a sudden, there was a bit of a change. Clinton became more popular, especially in the second term. There are some insiders who argue that a great deal of it came down to where he was getting his advice from, namely his vice president, Al Gore. The belief is that Gore was actually advising Clinton on what he should be doing instead of what he should not be doing. And as such, Clinton seemingly found himself skyrocketing in popularity. As such, when it came time for his second term to come to a close, there were some folks who kind of wish he could have run for a third term, and had he the ability, he could have won one. Number 43, George Walker Bush. Now, for George W. Bush, there is a great deal to be said about him. His first term is undeniably going to be September 11th. Everyone remembers that particular moment where he stood with the firefighters in New York City and said that their voices would be heard and that the terrorists would be brought to justice. Had this been his only term in office and he was done in 4 years, one could argue that he may have been one of the better presidents, if not one of the greatest, in the 21st century, mainly because he held the nation together in one of its most fragile and difficult moments. And yet his presidency is undeniably going to be attached instead to the Iraq War that he initiated, which would see the downfall of Saddam Hussein and then a destabilization of the entire Middle East region. To further complicate matters was also the economic recession, the Great Recession, which would certainly devastate anyone who was trying to run for election as a Republican in 2008. This unexpected downturn of the economy affected millions and put a very sour note on people when it came to George W. Bush and anyone associated with him. Number 44, Barack Obama. For Barack Obama, history will forever remember him as the very first African-American president in United States history. There's no denying that. And coming in during an economic recession, his goal of trying to create universal health care coverage in the nation was certainly a very bold one. However, some critics argued that it may have been too much too soon, and no sooner was the Affordable Care Act initiated than attempts to get rid of it were put into place. Now, Obama's administration, though, is rather unique, as the Supreme Court dictated that the Affordable Care Act was not so much a penalty, but rather a tax for those that did not have health care. But it would also see during his administration the legalization of gay marriage. As such, from a social point of view, Barack Obama is seen as one of the most reform-minded and change-minded presidents to occur. From international politics, he certainly could have done a lot better, as we would see the rise of Russia as a new threat to the United States, and also see the rise of ISIS in the Middle East. Number 45, Donald Trump. Now, Donald Trump, there is quite a bit to say about him, both good and bad, depending on who you speak to. When it comes to good, one could argue that Donald Trump really never lied about who he was. I mean, the fact that people said, oh, we could not believe this is the man we elected, well, it's not as if you didn't know. His years on The Apprentice meant that everyone saw his personality. There's nothing to it. And yet, when it comes to bad, he certainly was the type of president who proved that he could be more divisive than a unifier. As such, his exact position in history will be a very difficult one to determine. Now, I can see the comments section coming alive already saying he's the worst president of all time, absolutely horrible, fake news, versus others who say greatest president ever, bring him back. The simple reality is that ever since Richard Nixon going forward, every president listed to this point in time is what's called a current event president, which means until 50 years have passed since their time in office, it is still deemed current event. You need historians who were born well after the fact and can objectively look back at these presidencies to give a final verdict. But most likely, one of the most prominent positions on the legacy of Donald Trump could be from the British Parliament, wherein it was stated that Donald Trump may go down to be the most hated president in United States history, namely because he did everything he set out to do. Number 46, Joseph Biden. Now, Joseph Biden's presidency at this point in time of recording is still relatively fresh. We haven't even hit the midterm point yet. And the problem he is having is that his approval rating keeps going down further and further. Part of this is largely in part thanks to inflation. In addition to this, there's been a great deal of social unrest, and to further complicate matters, Russia is once again beginning to flex its arms as it attempts to do a power play move in Ukraine. Now, while all these things are occurring, Joe Biden could just go ahead and turn things around for the latter half of his first term. He could potentially rise to the occasion and prove to be an extremely capable president. He just needed to get all the pieces of the puzzle put together. Then again, it could be a complete disaster. We don't know. And much like our previous entry for the presidency, he is a current event president. So judging him right now is rather foolhardy. It takes time. Yes, we can have opinions about him, but it's important to remember that only time will tell exactly what Joe Biden's presidency will do for the country. For more information, please consider these suggested titles. Be sure to click on the left-hand side of the screen to subscribe to our show, and on the right-hand side for our latest episode. and we will see you again for the next episode of Milling Through History.